Welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. My name is Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you'd like to get in touch with us, give us a call or send us a text at 812-550-6234 or send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. We would love to take comments or questions that way. And we also take requests if you have specific topics that you would like for us to cover on this program or any of our other venues. Today we are going to be spending some time on Psalm 3, and we're going to think about authorship and history, but of course we're also going to get into the text and then finally apply the words and thoughts that we find in Psalm 3 to ourselves. Now, for some of you eagle-eyed observers with elephant memories and maybe some other animalian-enhanced senses, you'll remember that we just went over Psalm 2 about 3 weeks ago on this program. And I could understand you thinking a couple of different things. First, are we going to go through all 150 of these in order? And if so, what happened to Psalm 1? But never mind that, I don't think I have the stamina to sit through all 150. Well, don't worry, that's not the plan. What happened is that I selected Psalm 2 because of the aftermath of the entire election cycle and all the nonsense that is still ongoing as I record this, by the way, illustrating my point even further. But I happened to select Psalm 3 to preach on a few weeks ago as well. And while I had envisioned that as actually something of a break, a nice, easy look at a well-composed prayer, I found myself in my happy place when it came time to present it, because history and geography and God's plans and moral quandaries and family strife and a crisis of faith and prophecy and careful literary composition all come together into one moving and meaningful poem that reverberates through the ages with ramifications by the time of Jesus and even for us today. So I decided to share that with you all, and I hope that you will find it as valuable as I do. Let's begin by reading Psalm 3. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. Arise, O Lord. Save me, O my God. For you strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. What sort of situation might have prompted these words? Just from the content, we can speculate a little bit. The psalmist clearly feels surrounded by enemies, in fact, surrounded by thousands of them. And more are revealing themselves even as he writes. He says in verse 1, many are rising against me. And they're either atheistic or they believe that the writer hasn't earned God's favor, and that's probably a better fit when they say there is no salvation for him in God. As for the time when these words were written, verse 4 mentions God's holy hill, which we may assume to refer to Zion, which is Jerusalem. So this would be after the conquest of Jerusalem, and that puts it in the period of the United Kingdom of Israel at the earliest. Maybe it's a persecuted prophet. Elijah felt alone very often. He was surrounded by many thousands of enemies. He had a showdown on Mount Carmel with 450 prophets of Baal, as well as 400 prophets of Asherah, and all of the assembled people, including the king of Israel, were all against him. I could see him praying words like these. Jeremiah prophesied during the period when Babylon was breathing down the neck of Jerusalem, and they were in fact going to win, and Jeremiah had the unenviable task of telling the people that the Babylonians were going to win, and that they should give up if they wanted to live. They didn't take very kindly to that. They didn't treat him very well as a result. It could be Ezekiel. He was tasked with telling the Israelites that Jerusalem was going to fall as well, except he was already in one of the waves of exiles that were taken away into Babylon. He met a lot of resistance. A lot of it was hostile. Maybe it was after that exile. Someone like Ezra or Nehemiah or Zerubbabel, as they all did their best to rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the nation of the Jews after they finally got to come home from Babylon. They had to deal with the surrounding nations trying to stop the work that they were doing. Or maybe it was back during the divided kingdom, a weak king surrounded by dangers. Someone like Joash, who as a child was just barely saved as his grandmother went through and murdered all of the rest of their family. Maybe it was someone like Hezekiah, who was king of Judah when Sennacherib and his army of Assyrians came to besiege Jerusalem, and things got very, very dicey for them. It would fit especially well into this last category, these kings in trouble, especially when we consider the superscript. We didn't read this when we went through the psalm, but before verse 1 even begins, we read a psalm of David when he fled from Absalom, his son. So we were right in thinking maybe it's a king, but we didn't have the right king in mind, did we? Okay, it's attributed to David, and it's even attributed to a particular situation when he fled from Absalom, his son. But what exactly happened between David and Absalom? Why did David flee from him? And why does it matter to us? Turn back to 2 Samuel 13. We're not going to spend a bunch of time reading everything here, but if you'll at least browse through as we go through several chapters and rebuild the story, I might be refreshing your memory, and I might be telling you for the first time some of these things that happen in David's family. In 2 Samuel 13, we meet Amnon and Tamar. Amnon is the firstborn son of David. His mother is Ahinoam, and that will become important in a little while. And Amnon rapes Tamar. Tamar is his half-sister, the daughter of David, whose mother is Maacah. Absalom is another son of David's. He is the third-born son, and his mother is also Maacah, not Ahinoam. He shares a mother with Tamar as well as a father, so she is his full sister. Well, Absalom finds out what Amnon has done and understandably is quite furious. But when their father doesn't do anything about it, Absalom bides his time. And 2 years later, he arranges a sort of blue-collar party with sheep shearers and such of David's household, and he arranges for all of David's sons to attend this party too. He gets Amnon, his oldest brother, drunk, and then he has him killed. And then he runs away. He runs to Geshur, because Maacah, his mother, is the daughter of the king of Geshur. She was given to David as part of a marriage alliance between these two nations, and so that means Absalom's maternal grandfather is the king, and he's also an ally of David. And he takes refuge with his grandfather for 3 years, knowing that David is not going to risk war in order to get him, and knowing that his grandfather is not going to turn him over. In chapter 14 of 2 Samuel, Absalom returns back home. This comes about because Joab, who is the captain of David's army, convinces David that in order to get over his melancholy depression, he should bring Absalom back. But David, while he invites Absalom to come home, at least to his proper nation, he refuses to see him. Not only is he refusing to reconcile with him, he's also refusing to bring him before him to punish him. After 2 more years, which means that 7 years have now passed since the incident with Tamar that started this whole thing, Absalom pressures Joab to get him an audience with his father David. And David eventually agrees, and he actually forgives Absalom. We read in 2 Samuel 14, verse 33, "Then Joab went to the king and told him, and he summoned Absalom. So he came to the king and bowed himself on his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom." So they're reconciled. It seems like things are pretty good, but they're really not. In chapter 15, Absalom begins to undermine his father. He deliberately sets about winning the hearts and minds of the people by setting up shop in front of David's palace and pandering to the suppliants who are coming and going. He tries to show favor to anyone who is nice to him, especially anyone who exalts him. And essentially, when people go in to see his father and they come back, Absalom asks, okay, what did he do for you? And when they tell him, Absalom says, oh, I would have done so much more. So he panders and flatters his way into their hearts, and he spends 4 years doing this. That means now 11 years have passed since the original incident with Tamar and Amnon. Then, when Absalom judges that the time is right, he declares himself king at Hebron. David was first crowned at Hebron. So there's some symbolism attached to this. Absalom is not messing around. He has thought this through very clearly and very carefully. And David quickly realizes what this means. In 2 Samuel 15, let's read verse 14. Then David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly, and bring down ruin on us, and strike the city with the edge of the sword. He says it's time to get out of here. He doesn't even try to put up a resistance. Instead, he flees. Chapter 16 covers David's exile. He had to abandon Jerusalem. He has relatively few followers with him. There are several thousand, but that's not as many as Absalom has. He is cursed by a member of the family of Saul, the king before David. This man is named Shimei, and we read about this curse in verses 7 through 10 of 2 Samuel 16. And Shimei said as he cursed, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned, and the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. Then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, said to the king, Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head. But the king said, What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, Curse David, who then shall say, Why have you done so? This is a really depressing situation. David has abandoned his home. He's abandoned his throne. He is crossed over. He's not even within the borders of the nation of Israel per se anymore. And he's having to listen to horrible people cursing him. Meanwhile, Absalom returns to Jerusalem, and he's welcomed there as the king. He publicly sleeps with David's concubines in order to make it very clear he's not going to back down. He's not going to return to his father's household. He's not going to accept any reconciliation. This is it. In chapter 17, Absalom gathers his armies, which are now well in excess of 12,000 men. And then there's a servant named Hushai who plays double agent, and he goes and tells David that he needs to leave his camp in order to avoid being killed. In chapter 18, Joab, the captain of the army, leads David's men and defeats Absalom and his army. Then Joab tracks down and kills Absalom. The story isn't over, but at least the menace is gone. Psalm 3 fits around the time Absalom takes Jerusalem, the end of chapter 16, beginning of chapter 17. David is now threatened by massive armies, greater than his own and growing every day. He has been cursed by Shimei, and he is questioning himself whether his overthrow is God's will. When this man cursed him, and one of David's faithful servants said, Why don't I go take care of it for you? David didn't just say, No, it's not a big deal. He didn't just say, No, we don't need to respond with such wanton violence to every hostile word. He said, Maybe it was God's will. He is genuinely questioning whether God is with him. His best counselor, named Ahithophel, has sided with the rebels. His son, whom he has preserved and forgiven when he clearly deserved great punishment, his son wants to kill him. His people have turned away from him. The whole situation looks incredibly bleak it looks hopeless. And somewhere in the middle of it all, David sits down and composes a psalm. O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Well, this is his assessment of the situation. Everyone seems to be turning against him, one after another. His righteousness and God's favor for him are being not just questioned, but outright denied by many people, and questioned by David himself. What David sees around him is nothing but evil and continual threats to his life. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, and the lifter of my head. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. And yet, even though he is in these horribly trying circumstances, even though he is questioning whether maybe it's God's will that he fall, he still trusts God. He lists 3 ways that he looks at God here. First, he calls him a shield, as if God is personally interested in protecting David. Not quite at David's service, but deliberately standing between him and dangers. He's proven this many times before, and David trusts that he's going to do it again. He also says that the Lord is his glory. Think about that. David's glory is not himself, as it would be with most kings. David was extremely powerful. He was extremely wealthy. He was extremely accomplished. He was glorious. Throughout the rest of the Old Testament, when prophets and even God himself want to compare various periods to the glory days, they compare it to David's time. David's reign, that's the glory days. And yet David says, you, O Lord, are my glory. He considers God to be more important than he is, and he considers himself to be glorified even in these current circumstances, not because of himself, not because of his power or his position or his royalty, but because of God. And finally, he says that the Lord is the lifter of his head. It's a strange expression, but think about the situation in which he finds himself. Although David is king, he sees himself as being a poor beggar, and yet he's favored by God, his king. It's as if he is in mourning, he's unwilling to lift his head and meet the eyes of the people in front of him, let alone God. And yet God will reach down and lift his drooping head and look at him face to face. It doesn't seem to fit the current situation, and yet he believes these things to be true from his past experience with God and because he trusts that God still hears his prayers. Given that he was saved by a message that came through the high priest Zadok, whom David had asked to remain in Jerusalem and tell him what to do, perhaps David composed this after being told to abandon his river camp, but before the battle, which seems to take place roughly the next day. In that case, he still has the greater task ahead, but he has seen some evidence that God is still with him. Look at the way that he describes this situation. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. Do you think in those terms when you lie down to sleep that maybe I won't wake up again? It's possible, but you probably don't consider it every night. That's where David was right now. And yet, because of this message that had come to him from a representative of the Lord one way or another, he was able to escape from that camp. He was able to escape the likely end that he would have met that very night in his sleep. And instead, even though he had to leave that situation and go out into the country and be in a position where he was even more exposed, at least he was unknown. And so he lay down and slept in hope that he would make it through the night. And then we find him saying, I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. So, what reason does he have to fear the armies that surround him? He says, I will not be afraid of them, even though there are thousands of them, because he trusts that God is with him. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you strike all my enemies on the cheek, you break the teeth of the wicked. Still, he has a plea to register with God. It's based on his faith in him. He's asking God to protect him and to save him from those evil men. He has seen God work before, and he's seen that God's salvation isn't harmless. It's not sterile. It's not clean. Look at the imagery here in verse 7. You strike all my enemies on the cheek. You break the teeth of the wicked. That is somewhat grisly. God fights for those he loves, and he causes not just the failure of their antagonists, not just their shame or embarrassment, not even just pain, but devastation and even disfigurement when people are endangering his servants. It's incredible. Well, that's exactly what happened, isn't it? The battle that came the next day was not clean. It was not bloodless. It was a horrible, gruesome, grisly affair, but it brought about God's salvation for the one whom he loved, for the one who trusted in him. And finally, we read the last verse, salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing be on your people. Those final two lines kind of seem like afterthoughts, but I think they're actually the most profound lines of the entire psalm. How was Absalom trying to bring about salvation? It was through force of arms, also through deceit and treachery and murder and even arson. That goes back all the way to the Tamar incident, so many years before. Absalom trusts himself to bring about justice and to keep himself alive and to bring about his desired ends, and he will stoop to whatever evil is necessary in order to accomplish it. But Absalom was wrong. Salvation, it turns out, is God's arena. It belongs to him, and Absalom can't do anything to stop it. David also asks God's blessing on his people, which seems out of context. He's talking about deliverance from personal danger. So where did this come from? To answer that question, let's consider, who is God's people? Perhaps David is just referring to his followers and he's asking for God's blessing in the battle. But no, that's not really true. God's people was all of Israel, not just those who followed David. David knows that. And yet what had all Israel just done? Most of them had turned against David. David asks for salvation and he trusts that God will judge the wicked and preserve the righteous, but he also asks God to bless the very people who have recently turned against him. This conclusion shows David's outlook throughout this whole experience. It's not the only place where we can find this. In 2 Samuel 15, as David is leaving Jerusalem, we read in verses 30 and 31, "But David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot and with his head covered, and all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they went up, weeping as they went. And it was told David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." Okay, this sounds like David is just whining about what he has lost, and he's thinking selfishly and afraid that Absalom is going to be victorious instead of him. But that's not the attitude that we just saw in Psalm 3, is it? He's a lot more confident. He's a lot more trusting. Even though he's questioning himself, he's not questioning God. And he's not really even questioning what the outcome is going to be. He just knows that he's going to put it in God's hands. And he trusts that God will do the best. So when he walks up this mountain weeping, barefoot and with his head covered. It's not that he's weeping for himself. He is overtly mourning something else. He's weeping for his people. His people have been divided, and many of them have sinned greatly. And in order for God to save David, he's going to have to kill a lot of his own countrymen. He doesn't weep because he misses his power. He weeps for the evil that has been done and the inevitable consequences of it. David writes this psalm and he prays this prayer because he's worried about his own life, but more than that, because he's worried about God's people. And that is a beautiful thing, isn't it? But is it only useful for historical purposes? At the beginning of this, I pointed out several other situations in the roughly 600 years between David and Malachi, any of which would have fit this psalm rather well. And if we look outside of that range, we would find many, many others. The most obvious and meaningful application of Psalm 3 is to Christ himself. We could go through this entire psalm again and assign a parallel from Christ's time on earth to every single line. Some of those are obvious, but let's consider these. The priests and Pharisees considered Jesus' crucifixion to be God's justice. They considered that there was no salvation for him in God. Jesus prayed to his Father, who answered him audibly on several occasions. Jesus went into the grave and yet awoke because God sustained him. Jesus was surrounded by thousands of scoffers as he hung on the cross, yet he did not fear them. And throughout the whole thing, he only ever asked blessings on the very people who rejected him. So David's example is Christ's example too, and they're both worth following for us when difficulties arise. They probably won't come in the form of treachery and betrayal and attempts on our lives, but we do find ourselves in conflicts, and sometimes we do feel persecuted, and often we feel like we're being treated unfairly. How will we respond in those circumstances? Will we try to bring about our own salvation by our own strength? Or will we trust in God and ask him to bless even those who set themselves against us? This psalm is one of my favorites, and it doesn't get enough attention. It's a great one to memorize, actually, and the more you think about it, the more you get out of it. I hope that this short look at it with me today has been valuable to you, and I hope that you will remember the lessons that we took from it and come back for more on Iron Sharpens Iron.